Have you ever seen a lawyer win a case before it even started? In 1973, my parents had finally saved enough to build a modest little ranch house out in the country. They went through a small local bank, which approved the mortgage, and signed a contract with a contractor named Bob to start the build. Bob, unfortunately, was one of those guys who booked far more projects than he could handle. He rarely showed up himself, instead sending out underqualified workers who clearly had no idea what they were doing. As a result, the build dragged on for months longer than expected, and when work did get done, it had to be ripped out and redone, over and over again. The problems weren't minor either. One wall was built straight through the bathtub because someone forgot to erase a line on the blueprints. Kitchen cabinets were fastened to the drywall using a couple of roofing nails without a single stud behind them for support. The garage door was framed into the living room instead of facing the driveway. It was chaos. My mother was told not to put anything heavy in the cabinets because they might fall off. The workers clearly didn't care. At one point, a plumber left his lunch bag sitting on a half-built kitchen cabinet, and instead of moving it, the cabinet maker built the rest of the cabinet around it. That lunch bag stayed entombed in the woodwork. When it came time for the final inspection, a representative from the bank showed up. My parents were waiting in the yard. They'd had enough. They told him plainly that they weren't going to sign off on anything. The house was a disaster. The rep got irritated, muttering that the bank had already paid Bob a significant amount. He marched up to the front door and pulled on the doorknob. The entire door, frame and all, came off and landed on him. It had been wedged in place, not even nailed. That was the last straw. The bank called Bob and told him to come deal with it himself. He finally arrived and attempted to take control of the project, but it quickly became clear that he was no better at construction than the people he'd hired. The build remained a mess. My parents stood their ground and refused to sign again. At this point, things took a darker turn. The bank began threatening foreclosure. Bob threatened to sue for breach of contract. Meanwhile, my mother was stuck in a freezing rental with 2 small kids, while my father worked 2 jobs to keep things afloat. The whole situation had become a nightmare. Desperate, my parents went to a local attorney named Tom. They laid everything out for him. The bad plumbing, the electrical mess, the walls in the wrong place, the threats from both Bob and the bank. They were terrified. All they had was their down payment. If this turned into a legal fight, they couldn't afford it. Tom sat quietly as he sifted through the paperwork, barely saying a word. My dad said it looked like the guy was just trying to figure out how to break the bad news gently. But then something shifted. Tom suddenly smiled. He looked up and said, "Let's get everyone together for a meeting tomorrow." The next day, they met at the bank. My parents were there, along with Tom, the bank rep and their lawyer, and Bob with his lawyer. Before anyone else could speak, Tom stood up and said, "My clients have decided they no longer want the house. Please remove it." The room froze. Everyone assumed he was joking, but then Tom calmly placed a deed on the table. The land was owned outright by my parents. The house, technically, was sitting on land the bank didn't finance, and Bob didn't own. Tom reiterated the house needed to be removed and the land returned to its original state. As it stood, the builder and the bank were trespassing. It took a moment, but the gravity of the situation sank in. Bob had built a house on land he didn't own. The bank had issued a mortgage for a house, but failed to finance the land it was on. If they tried to foreclose, they'd be repossessing a structure that wouldn't legally be there anymore. And Bob? He was staring down the cost of demolishing the house himself, while also having to repay what the bank had already given him. Suddenly, everything changed. The tone in the room shifted. The bank started treating my parents like old friends. Bob became cooperative. Work resumed immediately, and this time it was done properly. Everything was brought up to spec, and my parents didn't pay a dime more. Bob barely broke even on the build, and the bank's representative lost his job. As for Tom, he got a legendary story that attorneys probably still talk about in that small town to this day.